they were gone. Vanished in the dark without warning, without a single gunshot, without the sound of retreat. A patrol marched into the heart of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and never came back. When search parties followed, they found rifles still leaning against tree trunks, helmets half buried in mud ammunition, untouched, as if waiting for hands that would never return. And on the ground, pressed deep into the wet soil, were claw marks. Long, sharp, deliberate. Marks that no tiger, no bear, no known beast could have left. Reports described them in clipped military language: unit missing, equipment recovered, fate unknown. Yet behind those words lies a silence more terrifying than any battle. Survivors whispered of being followed by something that did not belong in the jungle, branches snapping in rhythm with their steps, guttural sounds rising from the dark eyes, glinting low to the ground, tracking them. Some wrote hurried letters home, confessing they felt hunted, that the jungle itself seemed alive, waiting. A singular disappearance. A mysterious occurrence. Again and again the pattern repeated. Patrols setting out strong and whole, returning only as rumors. Their absence marked not by graves, but by claw marks gouged into the earth. And in the silence of that war, it was as if the jungle itself had kept its own records, not in ink, but in fear, carved into the soil. It was the late 1960s. The war in Vietnam had stretched into every valley, every river crossing, every shaded canopy of jungle. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, more than a road, was a vast hidden system, an underground lifeline, that stretched from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia, feeding men and ammunition into the south. It was not a single trail, but thousands of winding footpaths, dirt roads, and concealed passages built and rebuilt under ceaseless bombing. Soldiers described it as a living organism, a body with arteries and veins, pulsing with the movement of entire divisions. And yet, beneath its strategic importance, there was something else, an atmosphere that no map or reconnaissance photo could capture. The canopy above was so dense that even at noon the light was muted, a dim green haze filtering through tangled branches. The air was heavy with dampness, smelling of soil and rot, every breath thick as if swallowed through cloth. At night the jungle pressed in tighter, alive, with sounds: the drone of insects, the rustle of leaves, the drip of unseen water. But between those sounds, soldiers spoke of pauses, unnatural silences, where even the cicadas fell quiet, as though listening to something larger moving through the undergrowth. Patrols vanished here, not in firefights, not in chaotic clashes, but in silence. A column of men could set out in the morning, and by dusk only their gear remained. Helmets dented with no bullet holes, rifles stacked or scattered ammunition boxes unopened. Sometimes there were footprints in the mud that led nowhere, cut off mid-stride, as if the men had been lifted into the trees. And always there were the claw marks, deep gouges in the ground, dragged across roots, and stone marks that experts dismissed as animal sign, but which bore a shape that no one could name with certainty. Official records were careful in their language. Reports filed in typed lines stamped with dates and numbers simply listed missing in action. Some entries noted patrol lost, presumed ambushed. The words were cold, precise, and final. Yet between the lines was something unspoken. The absence of gunfire, the lack of blood, the way weapons were found loaded as though the men had never even raised them. Those who returned, few shaken and often incoherent, described sensations they could not put into words. They felt watched, as if every step was measured against a predator's patience. They heard pacing in the brush, movements too deliberate for the wind. Some claimed to see shapes, massive outlines, slipping between trees, eyes glinting low to the ground. Others never spoke of what they saw at all, only muttered of something out there, before lapsing into silence. To the war command, the trail was a logistical artery. To the soldiers who trudged through it carrying rifles and packs heavier than their own bodies, it was a place where maps ended and superstition began. It was not merely enemy territory, it was a stage where men walked as prey, where war blurred into myth, and where even hardened veterans found themselves whispering prayers into the night. The documents that survive are stark, clinical, stripped of all emotion. On official paper, the words stand like gravestones, each line a summary of something far more complex than it admits. A 1967 report typed in courier font on military stationery begins with a cold header: patrol unaccounted for. It states with brutal brevity, unit departed at 0600 hours with 12 men. Equipment recovered in Sector 14. No sign of struggle, no blood trails, no enemy sign. Fate unknown. The signature at the bottom is clear, yet what it conceals is not. There is no attempt to explain why a patrol should vanish in silence. Field notebooks, far more personal, reveal the cracks in that silence. One reconnaissance private, whose words were later retrieved from a water-stained journal, wrote in uneven lines, "We lost them. Just gone. No shots fired. Their gear still here, ammo boxes, unopened, rifles full. Ground torn up like by claws. Big ones. Don't know how to write this. Don't know who'll believe." The last page trails off in jagged handwriting, as though the soldier had stopped mid-thought, reluctant or unable to describe further. The journal ends there, no more entries after that night. Newspapers back home carried faint echoes of these events, usually buried on back pages, often phrased in careful, uncertain language. An Associated Press dispatch from early 1968 reported another patrol declared missing in action along remote jungle routes. Official sources cite ambush or natural hazards. However, unconfirmed reports describe unusual signs upon the terrain. Military spokesmen declined to elaborate. Words like unusual, peculiar, and mysterious occurrence were sprinkled in small anomalies in otherwise formulaic war coverage. These articles rarely received follow-up, and the public, overwhelmed by headlines of larger battles, hardly noticed. But for families of those declared missing, the vagueness was salt in the wound. Letters intercepted or saved in archives show the inner fears that official reports never captured. One young soldier, writing to his wife just days before disappearing, confessed, "The jungle doesn't feel like land. It feels like something alive that doesn't want us here. The men don't sleep. They keep hearing dragging sounds at night. Claws on wood, claws on dirt. Some say it's tigers. I don't believe that anymore." That letter was the last communication he ever sent. His name weeks later appeared in a ledger under MIA. Even declassified intelligence files hint at the unexplained. A CIA field memo dated 1969, blacked out in places, carries a chilling fragment. Unverified accounts of abnormal animal predation in sectors 9 and 11. Patrol units lost with equipment intact. Local informants unwilling to discuss. Another heavily redacted entry mentions superstition among local guides, leading to refusal of passage through certain trail segments. The memo's authors never commit to explanation, but their caution is palpable. They treat the reports not as fiction, but as an intelligence anomaly. Together, these fragments, typed orders, hurried diaries, clipped news reports, desperate letters, redacted memos, form a strange mosaic. They describe events without ever naming them, circling the unexplainable with bureaucratic words: missing, ambushed, lost. Yet the patterns repeat with haunting precision. Men gone, weapons untouched. Paths ending mid-stride. Ground ripped open by gouges that match no known animal. And through it all, one phrase emerges again and again, like a chorus buried in the paperwork of war fate unknown. The documents stopped short, but the soldiers did not. In the black jungle nights, when firelight flickered on damp leaves and cigarettes glowed like tiny beacons in the dark, their voices carried the stories that official reports never dared to write. They spoke of something that moved in the trees, hunting without sound, a predator that did not belong to any world they knew. It was not a tiger, not a bear. These men had seen enough of those to know the difference. This was something else entirely. They called it the hunter in the trees. To some it was a shadow, to others a beast walking like a man. To all, it was a presence that left claw marks gouged deep into the earth, a reminder that something unseen was always following. The local villagers had their own names for it, words whispered like charms to ward off its approach. Guides who knew every hidden bend of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, men who could navigate the jungle blindfolded, would sometimes shake their heads and refuse to pass through certain valleys. They would not explain. They would only mutter about Rung Thing's sacred forest, where spirits walked after dark. These were guardians, they said, ancient watchers, who punished those who trespassed where they should not. In hushed tones, the people described shapes half man, half beast, with eyes like embers glowing in the leaves when the moon broke through the canopy. For the locals, the jungle was not merely terrain. It was alive, it was sacred, and it chose who returned. The men on patrol began to notice the smaller details that confirmed their unease. Some described the uncanny sensation of being followed, as if every step they took was echoed by something behind them. When they stopped to listen, the sound stopped too perfectly timed, as though mocking them. Others spoke of branches bending under weight where no figure could be seen, of flashes of movement at the edge of vision shadows that vanished the moment eyes turned directly upon them. In the stillest hours before dawn, some swore they heard growls, rumbling through the ground itself, deep and resonant, as if the jungle had its own voice. Stories multiplied. In one tale passed from unit to unit, a platoon camped beside a river. Woke to screams in the middle of the night, not the screams of men, but a sound that mimicked human voices in torment. Lanterns were lit, rifles raised, yet nothing moved in the trees. By morning, the riverbank bore enormous prints, tracks pressed deep into mud, upright like a man's, but far heavier, ending abruptly where the water began. The patrol left quickly, and the story traveled faster than they did. Another tale told of a Lao guide who warned his group not to cross a certain mountain pass. That path, he said, belongs to them. The soldiers laughed, dismissing his words as superstition. By the next morning, that patrol was gone. No shots, no sign of battle, just silence gears scattered like abandoned shells. The guide only shook his head, repeating what he had said the day before. The path is not for men. These whispers spread like wildfire, faster than any official communique. Around campfires, through hushed conversations, each disappearance grew into legend. For every skeptic who dismissed the tales as fear, magnified by exhaustion, there was another who swore he had seen the marks himself, or heard the mimicry of voices in the trees. The folklore began to shape reality. Each new patrol walked the trail under the shadow of two wars, the one recorded in strategy and reports, and the one fought in silence against something unseen. By 1968, the Ho Chi Minh Trail had become more than a lifeline of war. In the minds of those who marched it, it was a haunted corridor, a place where soldiers moved not as warriors, but as prey. Each claw mark carved into the earth was not only evidence, but omen. Each fate unknown, recorded in official ledgers, was to the men in the jungle another tally kept by the hunters who stalked them. The myth had merged with the war itself, and no one could tell where one ended and the other began. The mysteries of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The vanished patrols, the claw-marked earth. The silence, heavier than artillery fire, did not arise in a vacuum. They echoed like faint thunder rolling through time, repeating motifs older than this war. When soldiers whispered of hunters in the jungle, they were unknowingly reciting a chorus that had been spoken on other battlefields, under other skies, in other centuries. The details changed, but the shape of the story was always the same. Men disappear, weapons remain, the land itself bears inexplicable scars, and the survivors speak of shadows. If we look back to the mud and trenches of World War I, we find traces of the same eerie pattern. The Argonne Forest, thick with fog and riddled with dugouts, carried its own stories of squads swallowed whole. Records mention patrols leaving the trenches in the evening, never to return. When search parties went after them, they sometimes found rifles stacked neatly against trees, boots abandoned in lines, as though men had stepped out of them all at once. No shell craters, no signs of battle, no blood. In the journals of French soldiers, a phrase recurs, pris par la nuit, taken by the night. Men claimed they heard voices drifting through the mist, calling to them in familiar tones. Some swore the fog itself seemed to move like a predator closing in around its prey. Official reports reduced it to missing in action, but the folklore among soldiers insisted otherwise. The forest claimed them. 2 decades later, in the forests of Belarus during the Second World War, the motif appeared again. Wehrmacht patrols sent into dense pine stands reported back less and less often. Diaries recovered after the war speak of claw marks on frozen tree trunks. Deep gouges no axe could explain, found near the last known footprints of missing units. Soviet villagers whispered of the Leshy, the spirit of the forest, who lured intruders away with strange lights or deceptive paths. Soldiers already exhausted by partisan ambushes and the brutal cold began to murmur about men pulled into the trees. The official reports once again were curt: patrol lost, presumed enemy action. But inside barracks late at night, the men told each other that the forest had taken them in its own way. In the Pacific theater, the motif bent itself into island form. Marines advancing through dense jungles on Guadalcanal, New Guinea and the Philippines wrote home of patrols that vanished with no trace. One Marine diary from 1943 described finding the earth churned as if by claws, the foliage shredded in patterns too high for ordinary animals. Others heard guttural cries in the darkness that mimicked human voices, sometimes calling names of the very men in their unit. Local islanders explained that these were the spirits of the forest ancient guardians who resented the intrusion of outsiders. The soldiers hardened by battle found themselves clutching their rifles at night, not only against an enemy they could see, but against something they could not. The Korean War brought its own whispers. Near the Imjin River, entire night patrols disappeared under cover of darkness. Some men who stumbled back disoriented and trembling spoke of figures in the mist that led comrades away. The ground in those sectors was sometimes found clawed and furrowed, but reports softened it into animal activity. Yet the motif was the same: sudden disappearances, mutilated terrain survivors, unable to explain what they had witnessed. And so, by the 1960s, when soldiers in Vietnam began to vanish on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the pattern was already familiar, even if unspoken. In every war, men had muttered the same stories, attached to different names, filtered through different folklore. In France, it was the night. In Belarus, the Leshy. In the Pacific, the jungle spirits. In Korea, figures in the mist. And in Vietnam, it became the hunter in the trees. This recurring motif suggests something larger than coincidence. It is as if the battlefield itself, any battlefield, summons a shadow war of its own. Perhaps the collective fear of men pressed to the edge of endurance conjures old myths to life. Or perhaps something older than humanity waits at the edge of every war, feeding not on food, but on the chaos of men marching, fighting, dying. The repetition is uncanny. To historians, it appears as a pattern threaded through military records, missing patrols, ambiguous reports, clipped language concealing unease. To the soldiers, it was more immediate, the knowledge that they were not the first to walk into a forest and never return. That others decades and continents away had vanished in precisely the same way. And to those who whispered by dim firelight on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, it was proof of something chilling, that war does not only pit man against man, but also reawakens predators that wait for the chance to step out of the shadows. By 1968, those who walked the trail no longer thought of themselves only as soldiers. They felt like prey in a story older than their war. The motif had returned again, dressed in jungle green, marked not by bullets or shrapnel, but by claw marks carved into the living earth. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was already a place of hunger, exhaustion, and dread. But within that suffocating corridor of vines and shadows, there are fragments of testimony, uneven, sometimes contradictory, yet too persistent to dismiss that form the dark climax of this mystery. It is here that the line between official history and whispered fear frays completely. One account tells of a sergeant, the only survivor of a 12-man patrol. He was discovered at dawn, stumbling along a supply track, clothes in tatters, face caked in mud, eyes hollow with terror. He clutched nothing, not his rifle, not his pack. Interrogators pressed him for details. What happened to his men? Why had he abandoned his weapon? At first he spoke in fragments, branches breaking, eyes in the dark. We kept moving, but it moved with us. Then his voice dropped, repeating the same words over and over. It wasn't the enemy. It wasn't the enemy. The transcript of his debrief, now a brittle relic in the archives, is riddled with black bars of redaction. Only scraps remain visible, followed for days. Growls from both sides. Something took them one by one. Within a week, the sergeant was declared psychologically unfit for duty and removed from the theater. Officially, his story ceased there. Unofficially, soldiers remembered his face the way his eyes seemed to look past them, as though still fixed on something in the trees. Another chilling artifact emerged from the jungle itself. A patrol journal recovered months later, its cover warped by rain and mold. The handwriting grows uneven as the pages progress, as though the writer's hands shook while he wrote. The men hear it too. Not just me. Something walking with us, circling. Scratches in the dirt again, long like knives. Tonight, strange lights, glimpses in the branches. Eyes, they don't blink. They don't look human. If we don't make it back, the entry ends mid-sentence. The last page is ripped, edges ragged as if torn in panic. The journal was discovered near a small clearing where helmets and rifles lay scattered. No human remains were found. Engineers stationed along one sector spoke of photographs. Grainy black and white frames that allegedly showed supply crates, torn apart lids, pried open as if by immense claws. The story goes that the photographs circulated briefly among lower ranks before being seized by intelligence officers. After that, they vanished. No one could confirm whether they were destroyed or locked away. But their absence became its own kind of evidence. Soldiers whispered, "They don't want us to see." Then there are the contradictions, the double voices of bureaucracy. One after-action report lists a lost patrol as ambushed presumed enemy activity, the language neat and clinical. Yet another file from the same incident explicitly notes no evidence of hostile fire, no expended ammunition, weapons recovered in functional condition. The two accounts sitting side by side cancel each other out, leaving only confusion. To some, this is the most frightening part, not that the enemy had erased men, but that their own command did not, or could not, speak a single truth about what happened. The climax builds most sharply in the recurring motif of claw marks. Dozens of testimonies mention them. In the mud gouges stretched longer than a man's forearm. Across tree trunks, deep scratches spiraled upward, as though something massive had climbed with hooked hands. Even armored surfaces were not immune. There are unverified accounts of claw-like impressions etched into the paint of abandoned vehicles. The soldiers argued over their origin. Too large for tigers, too deliberate for wild boars, too precise to be dismissed as storm damage or accident. A lieutenant, quoted reluctantly in one internal memo, admitted, "If they are natural, I have never seen their like before. They resemble the marks of a hand, but not of any man." By 1968 and 1969, the stories had reached fever pitch. In some units, men would refuse to march certain stretches of the trail at night. Guides would turn back muttering about cursed valleys. Patrols carried extra ammunition, not for firefights, but for whatever they felt was moving with them in the brush. In field hospitals, wounded men whispered to each other of the hunters, their voices low, as if naming it aloud gave it power. The climax of this story does not rest in a single disappearance or a single diary or a single claw mark. It rests in the accumulation, the layering of reports, testimonies, artifacts, contradictions, and silences until the mystery itself becomes undeniable. Every scrap of evidence seems to point in two directions at once, the official files leading toward nothing but bureaucratic emptiness, the whispered accounts pointing toward a predator that no one could name. Between them hangs the terror of the unknown. And in that void, the question that chills more than any answer: if these men were not lost to the enemy, then what power had taken them? If rifles remained loaded, if boots still stood in mud, if helmets rested where heads should have been, what force could erase men so completely, leaving only claw marks in their place? That is the climax of the Ho Chi Minh Trail mystery, not merely death, but erasure. A predator that left no bodies, only silence, only gouged earth. A reminder that in war, there are enemies beyond those listed in the orders of battle. The war has long since ended, but the jungle does not forget. The Ho Chi Minh Trail lies quiet now, overgrown, reclaimed by roots and vines. Where once columns of men marched under the weight of packs and rifles, only drifting mist and the cries of unseen birds remain. Yet beneath the green silence, scars still lie hidden, the faint impressions of pathways, the gouges on trees too deep for time to erase, and the stories whispered by those who survived. The official record closed the case with a stamp MIA, fate unknown. To governments, these men were entries in a ledger, rows of numbers filed away in archives. But to their comrades, their absence remains a wound that no closure can heal. Some veterans, when asked about those patrols, pause too long before answering. They mutter fragments, eyes in the dark branches snapping. It wasn't them, it was something else. Then they stop, and the silence between their words says more than any testimony. Folklore has filled the void where facts end. In the villages along the old trail, elders still speak of valleys that remain cursed where guides refuse to tread after sunset. They tell of spirits cloaked in shadow, half beast, half human, that punish intruders. Hunters who wander too far claim to find strange claw marks carved into bark, fresh as though written yesterday. In these stories, the jungle is not just land. It is a living force keeping tally of those who never returned. And the motif repeats across history, a haunting thread binding wars together. In France, men were taken by the night. In Belarus, the forest spirit Leshy lured them away. On Pacific Islands, guardians of the jungle left only gouged earth. In Korea, figures in the mist stole patrols. And in Vietnam, along this trail, they whispered of hunters in the trees. Across borders, across decades, across cultures, the shape of the story remains. Men vanish, weapons stay, and the land itself seems complicit. Coincidence? Or the same presence wearing different masks, called by war? Like blood calls to predators. Even now, decades later, researchers walking sections of the trail report a strange heaviness in the air. Some describe sudden silences where even insects stop as if the forest itself holds its breath. Others claim to see impressions in the earth too large for human boots, too deep for passing animals. When the wind rustles the canopy, it sometimes carries what sounds like voices, low broken, almost like men calling each other across distances that no longer exist. Perhaps the true question is not whether something stalked those soldiers, but why war itself seems to awaken predators older than the nations that wage it. Does the chaos of blood and fear tear open a doorway for shadows that wait at the edge of human sight? Or are these stories simply echoes of our own terror given form by the jungle, the forest, the mist? The trail gives no answer. It remains silent, a corridor of green shadows and forgotten names. The helmets rust, the rifles lie buried beneath soil. But the claw marks, those gouges in bark and stone, remain as if carved yesterday, reminders that something once walked beside men, and perhaps still does. So the question lingers in the damp air of the jungle. If those patrols did not fall to the enemy, then what power claimed them? And if war has always carried such shadows waiting unseen, will the next battlefield awaken them once more? This is the silence left behind by the Ho Chi Minh Trail. A silence heavy with footsteps that do not belong. Screams that were never answered, and marks carved into the living earth that time refuses to erase. You have just heard another file from Classified History. If you wish to follow the trail of mysteries that official archives could never close, subscribe, and remember, some paths were never meant to be walked, and some hunters never sleep.